Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Importing and Exporting Biological Samples. I'm Melissa Maripodi, the editor of Pharmaceutical Technology, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are pleased to bring you this webcast presented by Pharmaceutical Technology and sponsored by Pixit Labs. I'd like to share a statement from our sponsor. Pixit Labs and EMA Biotech provide a range of bioanalytical lab, spatial bioanalysis, and spatial biology solutions for biotech and pharma companies. Advance a small or large molecule from discovery through clinical development and NDA approval. So we do have a few important announcements before we begin. The webcast is designed to be interactive, so we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit them by typing them in the Q&A box, which is found at the bottom of the video player. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small icon in the bottom right corner of the media player. The slides will advance automatically during the event, but if you do have any technical problems viewing or hearing the presentation, just click on the question mark help widget in the top right of your presentation window. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. We are pleased to be joined by Mark Van. Mark joined Pixit Labs Colorado in 2018 and serves as the operations support manager overseeing the inventory management of samples and compounds, international logistics, procurement, and special projects. He has worked with a variety of biotech and pharma companies to successfully import and export their biological samples. Thank you for joining us today, Mark. Go ahead and get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Alyssa. Morning, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about imports and exports, but we're not going to be talking about the entire process of importing and exporting goods. We're not going to be talking about customs. We're not going to be talking about brokeraging. We're not going to be covering taxes and duties or how to deal with harmonization codes. And we're also not going to talk about importing and exporting other items like reference materials, drug compounds, controlled substances. Specifically today, we're going to focus on importing and exporting biological samples, and in particular, we're going to focus on one aspect of the process, which is how the U.S. government licenses and permits biological samples for import and export. And the reason we're going to be focusing on this topic is because this has a lot of impact. It can create a lot of impact and disruption to our sponsors' studies and timelines if it's not anticipated properly. Really, this webinar was born out of common concerns that I've heard vocalized from sponsors in the past. And at Pixit Labs, we do our best to educate our sponsors. And so this webinar is really part of that education. So what are some of our sponsors' common concerns? You know, in the past, I've heard sponsors say, I didn't know my samples require a license or permit. You know, what license or permit is required? Usually they, have this concern when they've started work with Pixit Labs and they get, ready to start their project, but no one knew on their end that they have to go through a process to obtain a license or permit, and they're kind of clueless about that process. The next common concern is, I need to ship my samples soon. How long until my license or permit gets approved? So, we've started to initiate work with a sponsor. They perhaps have a really tight turnaround on their project, and they want to get samples shipped to the U.S. as soon as possible to meet a deadline they have. And I get asked frequently, how much longer till this particular government agency approves our application for a license or permit? The next common concern, and this is a worst case scenario, is why are my samples held in customs? So this has happened in the past. Sometimes sponsors become a little quick and they will send samples to our site before we've gotten a proposal in place, before we've gotten a protocol, thinking that they're trying to be helpful or proactive. And in doing so, they may unwittingly send samples to the United States without any permits or licenses that are required. and then they end up getting held up in customs at the U.S. border, thawing potentially, and in worst case scenario, they can be rejected altogether. So why is it important to learn about the license and permit process? Well, we want to accurately plan your study's needs and timeline. So you want to be aware before you initiate a project what the U.S. government requires, what your samples are going to need in order to get them into the United States or out of the U.S., and also to better plan your study's timeline so you're not running into deadlines by accident. So you also want to avoid having your biological samples held, thawing, or rejected by customs. So really this is risk mitigation and trying to protect the integrity of your samples. So why does the U.S. government require licenses and permits? There's a number of issues that the U.S. government is concerned with. So some of the main points are is they want to prevent the transportation of exotic diseases into humans and ecosystems. So you might think about several years ago, I think there was an Ebola outbreak where people were traveling abroad to foreign countries and then traveling back into the United States, and they were having to be quarantined in New York. So just like humans traveling abroad, diseases can also be spread through cargo when they're being traded across international boundaries. And then also in agriculture and in the wilderness, if you think about blights or diseases to forests or crops, the U.S. government wants to try to mitigate those risks and maintain control over what enters our nation's borders. So the next thing that the U.S. government's concerned with is ensuring that if we do import potentially infectious or knowingly infectious materials for research into our country, they want to ensure that the facilities that are importing those materials have the correct biosafety level ratings to contain infectious agents. Infectious agents can be diseases or toxins, and it's important that we allow research to be done on these types of materials in order to develop strategies for combating them as a nation. The next concern is they want to prevent the supplying of illegal black markets. So black markets, you can think of weapons, you can think of drugs, you can think of endangered animals, exotic pets. So the U.S. government is, actively trying to clamp down on these markets and regulate these materials. And the last concern is they want to ensure that international trade does not threaten endangered species. So we'll talk about that more, but it's a really big concern of theirs. So let's dive into imports first. So we're going to talk about a number of U.S. government agencies that are concerned with biological samples and how their application process works. How does Pixent Labs navigate this process? So the first agency we're going to talk about is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and in particular, their Office of Law Enforcement. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is concerned with the importation of animal materials. They do not concern themselves with livestock or poultry animal materials or human materials. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife issues an annual license to Pixent Labs, and this stands for 1 year. And for our site, we have, for example, we have 2 licenses in place, one for cyno-macaque monkey materials and one for rat materials. And it's a pretty straightforward and easy process to apply for. You just go through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's website, and it's per site, per species. And I should say also that all of these permits and licenses that we're talking about, these are permits and licenses that Pixent Labs is responsible for obtaining, not the sponsor not the exporter. This is Pixent Labs' responsibility because we are the ones who are going to take possession of these samples once they cross the border. So we're the one who is responsible for obtaining these licenses. Yeah. So the next thing we got to talk about is how long it takes to get these licenses approved. So these are conservative estimates. The first estimate here for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is 1 to 2 weeks for a license. But again, these are annual licenses and we renew them. So it's not really difficult to obtain this license. And then once we obtain it, we just maintain a copy of it here at Pixent Labs. We don't need to provide the exporters with a copy of it for customs. It's something we just simply need to have in our records. So the next agency we're going to talk about is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service again, but particularly we're going to focus on CITES. So CITES is a big deal, and CITES stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So this is an international convention that's been agreed upon by participating nations all over the world, and the purpose of CITES is to put in place structure and law for trading materials of endangered animals to make sure that it doesn't impact their species. Each nation has a government agency that's responsible for carrying out and implementing CITES within their nation. And within the United States, that happens to be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And in particular, the Division of Management Authority, which is a different division than the previous Office of Law Enforcement that we talked about. So CITES is concerned with threatened animal materials. They do not concern themselves with non-threatened animal materials or human materials. And again, this is really easy to apply for. Pixent Labs just goes to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, and then we have to obtain a single-use permit. So this is not a license, this is a permit. And the single-use permit is per species and per duration of shipments. So as we're talking about permits, it's important to note permits can stand in place during the duration of an anticipated number of shipments. So let's say your project has 3 shipments over the course of 6 months. That permit will stand for that period of time. Now, with CITES, they list on their website 3 appendices that list the animals that are regulated by CITES. For importing animal materials, CITES only requires import permits for animals listed in Appendix 1. Appendix 1 animals are highly threatened, but Appendix 2 and 3, they do not require an import permit. And for pharmaceutical research purposes, the type of material that we import the most that CITES is concerned with are cynomacaque monkey samples, whether it's plasma or tissue. But because they're listed in Appendix 2, importing them is pretty straightforward. We don't have to go through CITES at all. Exporting, on the other hand, is a different matter. So how long does it take to get an application approved for a CITES permit? It can take conservatively 1 to 2 weeks. And once we obtain that permit, we maintain a copy with our records here, and then we provide the exporter with a copy of the permit to include with the shipment's paperwork. So when the shipment does cross the border with customs, they can quickly access the documentation that they need. So the next agency we're going to talk about is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And within the USDA, we're going to focus on the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service and their veterinary services. Because we're dealing with biological samples, the veterinary services are is the team that oversees these types of materials. So the USDA is concerned with livestock or poultry animal materials, including those bred for laboratory use. So when I first started getting involved with logistics, we were trying to import mini pig samples, and these mini pigs were never bred on farms. They were never used for agricultural purposes. They were bred for lab use in sites that are highly regulated. And because they're swine, the USDA still classifies them as livestock. So it's important to note that livestock does include laboratory bred animals. The USDA does not concern themselves with knowingly infected livestock or poultry animal materials. Those will be covered by the CDC. Or animal materials that are not derived from livestock or poultry. So animals like rats, mice, monkeys, wild animals, nor do they concern themselves with human materials. The process is straightforward. It's also through their website. And this is a single-use permit that's per duration of shipments, and it's per species. And there's one application form that we use, which is the VS63. Now, the USDA has a little bit of a longer approval lead time. This can conservatively take 4 to 6 weeks. And once we obtain a permit, we maintain a copy of it at the for our records. And then we also provide the exporter with a copy of that permit as well. So the final agency we're going to talk about for imports is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And they have an import permit program where you can go online and learn more if you need to. So the CDC is concerned with knowingly infected human materials, knowingly infected animal materials, and non-human primate materials and bat materials. They concern themselves with NHP materials and bat materials because those species are able to transmit diseases more readily into humans than a lot of other species. They do not concern themselves with not knowingly infected human materials and not knowingly infected animal materials. Again, this is a permit, it's not a license. So the permit is a one-time use, and it's per duration of shipment, and it's per species. And conservatively, it can take 4 to 6 weeks for the CDC to approve an application. And then once we do, we maintain a permit at Pixent Labs, and we also provide the exporter with a copy of the permit. Now, it's important to note that if you're trying to ship biological samples across the US border and they are not knowingly infected, you should include, the exporter should include a shipment with a letter with a shipment rather, that states something to the effect that the material is not known to be infectious. For liability reasons, we never draft those letters for the exporters, but we encourage them to include a letter of something to that effect, because if customs sees that it's animal materials, they're going to question if it's infectious or not. So this really just helps to appease customs interests and make sure that they know that the material is not infected and does not require a CDC permit. So it's important to have that letter if your material is not infected, no matter what type of material it is. So let's talk about exports. Exports are a lot easier. Getting samples out of the country is more dependent on the importing nation's rules and regulations. And I'm not an expert in other nations' permit and licensing processes. I usually depend on the importer to guide that process for their nation. And then they provide me in turn with the licenses and permits that they obtain for their nation. So we then include that with our shipments. So the first agency that is concerned with exporting biological samples is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And in particular, we're talking about CITES again. So like I mentioned before, the material that CITES oversees that we tend to import and export more of are cynomacaque monkey samples. And wild materials, which do not require import permits, they do require export permits. And this export permit is very complex to apply for. They require, records of where the monkeys were born, their parentage, how they were handled. It's a pretty complex application to fill out, and it requires multiple parties to be able to fill it up successfully. So this permit can take 1 to 2 weeks to obtain conservatively. And we maintain a copy here at Pixent Labs, and then we also include a copy of the permit with the shipment that we send out. And then the final agency we're going to talk about is the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security. So this is a much more relaxed agency to deal with in terms of trying to get documentation for an export. They basically just issue a license depending on the nation that you're shipping to's rules and regulations. So they're really concerned with knowingly infected human and animal materials, and they don't really care about not knowingly infected human or animal materials. This is per shipment, per species, and it's per nation. So really it's just the U.S. Department of Commerce's way of saying, okay, we'll allow you to export this, knowing that the importing nation is granted a license from the U.S. to be able to, accept these samples. This license can take 4 to 6 weeks conservatively to obtain. And then, of course, we maintain a copy here, and we include a copy of the license with the outgoing shipment. So these are the agencies that we deal with at Pixent Labs when we're trying to obtain licenses and permits for our sponsors' projects. Again, like I said, these licenses and permits are something that we have to obtain. The sponsors and sites that we deal with do not have to do this work, but it is important for sponsors to know how this process works and to understand if their project samples might require a license or permit and how long that could take, so that way they can better plan their studies timelines. So let's talk about planning. So how should you plan for shipping samples internationally? So these are just some good tips to know. The first one is just wait for Pixent Labs to obtain the license and permits before you ship. Like I said, in the past, we've had sponsors who were really eager to ship samples before there's proposals in place, before we have a protocol, before our laboratory is ready to do this work, thinking they're being helpful. And then they don't realize, oh, Pixent actually needs to get, license or permit for this, and they unwittingly jeopardize their samples in transit. So be sure to wait for us to get those first. The next tip is through the process of applying for these, when Pixent Labs reaches out to you, be sure to provide us with information for the application. So sometimes we have to reach out to our sponsors and get information about the exporting sites, contacts, their names, their addresses, phone numbers, details like that. So be prepared to work with us to provide information for applications. The next tip is to build application approval lead times into your studies timeline. We've kind of touched on that a little bit already. And then the final tip is to use couriers who can replenish dry ice in transit. So if you ship with a major courier like FedEx, DHL, UPS, they do have dry ice replenishing services, but you have to request it, and it's kind of unconventional for their courier services. And they also don't specialize in handling biological samples and transporting biological materials. But there are companies that do, like World Courier, MNX, Quickstat, BioCare, Marken. We recommend that when clients are shipping internationally that you go with one of these couriers who specialize and transporting biological samples because it's a lot safer for the integrity of your samples. And they do replenish dry ice in the event that there's delay in transit or, I don't know, God forbid, your samples get held at customs. So what information do applications typically require? So this is not comprehensive, but this is a general overview of much of the type of information that they ask about. So the first one is obviously the importer's name, address, and phone number. They want to know the exporter's name, address, and phone number. They also want to know the biological sample species, the origin of these samples, like where do they come from. They want to know the count of how many samples will be in the duration of shipments per shipment, and they want to know the volume per sample. And if we're dealing with the CDC, they also want to know the infectious agent and our biosafety level rating. They also want to know the duration of shipments. So again, is it 6 months? Is it a year? How many shipments over the course of that time will take place? They sometimes want to know a summary of research, especially the CDC. So if we're importing knowingly infected materials into the US, the CDC is going to ask, what are you doing with these materials? What is the purpose of the research? And this is something we typically can just copy and paste out of the introduction paragraph for protocols, and then we edit as we need to maintain confidentiality. So that's important to note. The CDC does care about why we're importing these samples. And then, of course, the final method of disposition. So Pixton Labs works with a contract service that handles all of our biohazard waste. So these applications want to know, who is your contractor? Are they qualified to dispose of biohazard waste? And what will be the final outcome of the samples at the end of the project? And typically, they either get marked for destruction or they get transferred back to the importer's site. So what is my application's current approval lead time? This is a question I get frequently. Like I said in the beginning of our presentation, this is one of sponsors' common vocalized concerns. So we started the process. We tell the sponsor we're going to have to apply for a permit for their samples. I let them know we've submitted the application, and they're really eager to know when it's going to be approved. It's important to note that we are working with the US government, and all of these agencies that we work with do not provide accurate guaranteed lead times. You can email them, you can call them, but the more you poke at them, the more they tend to kind of become irritated. So we typically let them do what they do, knowing our conservative lead times. But the lead times are based on the agency's workflow. So there have been times where, applications get approved in half the amount of estimated time. And that's simply because maybe they're not processing as many applications at that time in the year. Other times in the year, they may be swamped and it takes a long time to get an application approved. But if you call them and ask them, how much longer until my specific application's approved, they'll just tell you it's based on workflow. It's based on workflow. So you'll never get an accurate answer from them. Some applications have been approved within 1 week, and this has been when we're faced with a really critical project that has a really tight turnaround timeline. I've been able to call some of these teams at these government agencies and explain to them that we are a pharmaceutical research laboratory and that these samples are part of a really critical project for drug approval. And they will oftentimes understand that, and they will bump us to the front of the line. It's not something I like to do frequently because I don't want to get in the habit of calling them up and saying everything that we ship is critical, but there have been some very real scenarios where we've had to do that. So So let's talk about some examples. Let's work through some case examples here. So let's say we need to import rat plasma samples to Pixent Labs. So what do we do? So for this, we need to obtain an annual import license from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Again, that can take 1 to 2 weeks. And then we need to have the exporter include with the shipment a letter stating the material is not known to be infectious. Again, rats are not livestock, so the USDA doesn't care. They're not knowingly infected, so the CDC doesn't need to be involved. So it's pretty straightforward to import rat plasma. So let's say we need to import mini pig tissue samples to Pixent Labs. So with mini pig, we have to obtain a single-use import permit from the USDA, which can take 4 to 6 weeks. And the importer includes with the shipment a letter stating material is not known to be infectious. Again, mini pigs, even though they may not be bred for agricultural purposes, they are still classified as livestock because they are considered swine. And so the USDA does require permits for them. Let's say we're importing infectious human plasma samples to Pixent Labs. So what's required for that? We need to obtain a single-use import permit from the CDC. And this can take 4 to 6 weeks. So again, we have to fill out an application describing the select agent that these samples are infected with. And the CDC sometimes will ask for clarification. They'll want to know a summary of research, what are you doing with these samples? And is your facility equipped to contain this type of agent based on your biosafety level? So there's a little bit more to that process. Next example, let's say we're trying to import cynomonkey samples to Pixent Labs. Again, we have to work with the CDC. We obtain a single-use import permit from the CDC, which can take 4 to 6 weeks. And then we have the exporter include with the shipment a letter stating that the material is not known to be infectious. So even though it's not infected, like we said before, the CDC cares about non-human primate materials and bat materials because they can easily transmit diseases into humans, more so than other species. Next one, let's say we're exporting cynomonkey samples from Pixent Labs. So whereas importing requires the CDC's oversight, exporting requires the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's oversight because cynomacaque falls under Appendix 2 of CITES. So for exporting, we need to obtain a single-use export through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which can take 1 to 2 weeks. And then Pixent Labs includes with the outgoing shipment a letter stating the material is not known to be infectious. The next example is exporting mouse tissue samples from Pixent Labs. And this requires no import or no export license or permit from our laboratory. But it does require that the importer obtain an import license or permit based on their nation's laws and regulations. And again, I'm not an expert on other nations' government requirements for licensing and permitting, but we do look to our importers for that guidance. So this is an overview of how Pixent Labs navigates the import-export permitting process with our U.S. government, and some of the reasons as to why the U.S. government requires this oversight, and some of the anomalies we've encountered along the way. So with that, we'll open it up for Q&A, and I'll hand it over to George and Alyssa.
All right. Thank you, Mark, so much for your presentation. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I want to remind our audience how to submit questions. You can submit them by typing them in the Q&A box that's found directly below the video player. Okay, so our first question is, which license or permit is the most difficult to obtain?
So the most difficult to obtain, I think, is the CITES permit because the application is so comprehensive. It requires, like I said before, that we list where the species were bred in captivity, their parentage. They want to know how they were taken care of, They want to know if ethics committees were involved. So that application takes a lot of parties to be able to answer all the questions. And it can take a lot longer than some of the other applications to get approval.
Okay, and can one request or pay for a rush on an application?
No. You can call an agency and explain to them, plead with them that it's critical that you get this license or permit for scientific research purposes, but these agencies don't have an additional fee you can pay to jump to the front of the line. So unfortunately, no, the U.S. government works in mysterious ways. Yeah.
Okay, and how much do licenses and permits cost?
So at the most, I think it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's annual license for basic animal materials. That costs about $100 per license per year. So you're not breaking the bank on any of these. Some of them are less than $100, but none of them are really over that much. And this is a cost that Pixent Labs incurs because, again, we're the one required to obtain this for our possession of the samples. So the sponsors never have to worry about that.
Okay, the next question is, are transfected human cells considered infected human material?
Ooh, that might be a little bit beyond my expertise. So transfected, I haven't heard that term before, and I'm not a scientist by trade. I'm more in operations, but I can research that question and get back to you later.
Next is, what is the import and export permit status for recombinant proteins produced from CHO cells?
Again, that's a little beyond my expertise. I'm not sure what CHO cells are. I'd have to defer to my laboratory director and get guidance on that question.
Okay, and if I have deep sequencing data on my samples, do I provide that information? And then how would I interpret it for the agency?
Read that one again.
Sure thing. If I have deep sequencing data on my samples, do I provide that information, and how would I interpret for the agency?
I don't think the agency would concern themselves with that information. Typically, the information in the applications are pretty surface. They would just want to know who are the importers, who are the exporters, what are the species of the samples, what are the volume of the samples. So that information is not really going to be looked at by agencies.
Okay, this one says, I'm in the US and I need to export a postmortem sample to China. Do I need an export license, and how does this work on China's side?
Postmortem, I'd have to know what the material is specifically. And I'm not an expert in China's government's requirements because I don't live in China. I don't operate in China. So I would look to the importer in China to guide my process and wait for them to obtain their permits and licenses for their country and have them forward me copies of the permits that they obtain. But if it's postmortem, if it's a human material, you're not going to need any permit or license unless it's infected. Then you have to reach out to the Bureau of Industry and Security. If it's an animal material, again, the BIS would have to handle that. If it's an endangered animal material, you'd have to consult with the CITES appendices and then determine what sort of permits required if it is endangered.
Okay, this question's kind of asking for clarification. So for the example of importing cyno monkeys, I think you said it required the CDC permit and the letter from the exporter stating the material is not known to be infectious. Did I understand that correctly? And does the U.S. Bioanalytical Lab, the importer, also need to have the USFWS permit on file?
Yes. So for CytoMonkey, maybe I left that out of my slide. So Pixent Labs has an annual license in place with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that allows us to import cytomonkey materials over the course of 1 year. So that's the foundation. And then on top of that annual license, we have to get a single-use permit from the CDC because even though the monkey materials may not be infectious, the CDC is concerned with monkey and bat materials because they can transmit diseases into humans more readily than other species. And they also require a letter with the shipment stating that the material is not known to be infectious. So we have a permit for the material from the CDC and a letter just confirming that the material is not infectious.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Do you ever have to work with the DEA?
No, we're not dealing with drug compounds in this presentation. If I do import and export controlled substances, then I do work with the DEA, and I have done that in the past with various situations. But for the topic of this webinar, it's unrelated. The DEA doesn't concern themselves with biological materials like this.
Okay, and if we purify a protein from human cells, is that considered human material?
Yes.
Okay. It looks like we are out of time. I do want to thank our audience for attending and participating in today's event. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Pixent Labs, for making today's educational webcast possible. We would like to ask everyone in the audience to participate in a brief survey. It'll populate automatically today after the presentation has ended. And you will receive an email alerting you when the webcast is available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who could have missed today's live event. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will see you next time. Goodbye.